I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Prince George had been prepared for difficult conversations since he was old enough to understand what lay ahead for him. But he had no idea what his parents would think about Prince Louis. Behind closed doors, without cameras or formality, George learned that the sibling who had always supported him will eventually be deliberately guided toward a new life. In a matter of seconds, the future queen started crying. Before we get into more detail about what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates. Nothing could lessen what happened, even though Prince William carefully chose the event. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stayed close as George walked in, expecting another discussion about his own fate. The central functioning monarchy, which is made up of a few senior royals who carry out official duties for the crown, was part of his education. But he wasn't the focus of this conversation. It's related to Louis. And as his brother's name was spoken, George's face changed. He asked the question that every parent is afraid to hear from a child. Had Louis heired? The first person to reply was Catherine. Louis wasn't being ignored or punished, she said, gently but firmly telling him no. The intention was to give him the autonomy to establish a life outside of the monarchy, something George would never be able to achieve. As George grew more and more ready for kingship, Louis would gradually be encouraged to pursue his own interests, career, and a purpose that did not require him to constantly be by his brother's side. George lowered his head, then followed the words that shook the room. Why is he unable to remain with me? William felt the effect of that question, since he knew exactly what George was terrified of. The prince explained that the dangers of having a younger sibling, who was only defined by the heir, had been shown throughout royal history. Love could turn into a metaphor. Loyalty could become an obligation. Resentment may arise where closeness formerly existed. He was trying to protect the two boys from that pattern rather than keep them apart. But George heard something deeper. Becoming king would require more than just speeches, ceremonies, and service. The relationships he thought would never change might be slightly altered. George realized that his parents had been making this choice long before he realized it. Still, he couldn't see why they had been successful. William and Catherine were unable to ignore what would happen to them once Louis sentenced them to innocence, which was the beginning of that reality months before. George and Louis are seen by the public as having different roles in the succession. For their family, the numbers are essentially worthless. They are merely brothers, one who is becoming older and more aware of the impending crown. Because he is younger and more self-reliant, the other can still experience royal life as an adventure. That's precisely why the news was so upsetting. He did not grieve about royal formality. He was mourning what he believed to be a disappearing childhood. George had begun to notice the small differences long before anyone could explain them. Prince William knew that his eldest kid was getting close to the age when ordinary things could suddenly become regal. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had also worked hard to keep the children from being defined by such pressure at home. In the line of succession which establishes who takes the throne, George was placed higher than his siblings. But their parents had always tried to make sense of one family problem. Constitutional status had no bearing on who was more important. In George's story, Louis and Charlotte had no supporting parts. They were expected to narrate their own stories. In theory, George was aware that emotion made it more challenging. Even while Louis still felt so naturally free, every new conversation about duty seemed to pull him more away. When the younger boy considered tomorrow, he didn't have to worry about what the monarchy expected of him decades later. George couldn't. He had begun to worry that every lesson, every task, and every secret preparation for kingship was keeping him apart from the people he loved most, even if no one had intended it. Louis felt the distance before he realized it. He inquired if they might get together later, after noticing that George was particularly subdued following the distressing conversation with their parents. The question was simple. George forced a smile and nodded, but he didn't tell his brother why his attitude had changed. That silence was almost as painful to him as the reality itself. For the first time, Louis was not aware of the information George was holding about him. William then made an effort to make the objective clear. Louis was not being rejected. He was being prevented from developing into a guy whose identity depended entirely on the succession of his older brother. Catherine supported the notion because she wanted her youngest son to have friends, interests, a career, and a purpose of his own. George could see the logic. That made it worse. He hated the possible expenses, even if he understood the rationale behind the plan. Then, a single detail changed everything. William admitted that the concern was unrelated to the palace's design. Louis had told his father something harmless months earlier. The words were loving. They did not yet have a dangerous connotation. But at that moment, William heard a pattern that royal history had previously penalized. And once he heard it, he couldn't ignore it. The decision to split George and Louis's futures was taken without an official palace meeting. It began with a phrase from a child. Months before George learned, Louis was having a private conversation with his father about his future after a family engagement. William listened, smiled briefly, and then fell silent because Louis's naive comments revealed exactly the kind of reliance he had promised his offspring would never inherit. William knew that in a royal family, duty could easily ensnare affection. The royal hierarchy, which assigns family members varied degrees of obligation around the monarch and the heir, may have influenced a child's identity even before they knew what was happening. George's destiny was set in stone from birth. Charlotte and Louis didn't. Freedom was crucial because the prince had seen the dangers of a younger sibling spending adulthood searching for a role apart from someone whose destiny had already been decided. Louis had no intention of disclosing anything disturbing. He naively told his father after the family engagement that he wished to remain with George and help him become king when he grew up. William smiled at the loyalty of the words. Then he asked a simple question. What was Louis hoping to become? The younger boy hesitated. He finally said that he didn't really know, but just being near to George was enough. Long after the conversation was done, William considered that answer. Catherine recognized the horror as soon as he told her what had happened. She had always concurred with him that neither Charlotte nor Louise should be brought up to believe that their value depended on their ability to assist George. Loving their sister was one thing. It was different to base their entire future on him. William admitted that Louis' commitment had truly touched him, but he was unable to ignore the sentence's implications. His youngest kid was already planning his future life in terms of George's destiny rather than his own. The concern soon became a tactic. William and Catherine began discussing how the three children may share the same familial love without being forced to take the same royal path. George would gradually receive additional training in preparation for his future duties. Charlotte and Louis would be inspired to follow their own passions, friendships, studies, and eventually careers. The bond between the siblings would not change. The goal was to keep that link from becoming a cage. But one decision resulted in another problem. George was not included in those early conversations. His parents believed they were protecting him until the plot became more obvious. But when he discovered how long they had been discussing Louis's future, his melancholy changed. George could understand fear. He could even understand being separated. He was going to confront William because he was angry that the people he trusted the most had arranged for it without him. George's weeping did not last long. His anguish turned to frustration when he learned that his parents had been discussing Louis's future for months before speaking to him. The young heir had to confront the uncomfortable reality that decisions he made in his life would affect people he loved without his permission, possibly for the first time. And in a private discussion with William, George asked the question his father had been worrying about. "Why didn't you inquire as to whether I was the reason?" George felt limited by a destiny he had not chosen. His destiny was to become king. As a result, the expectation of ascending to the throne and becoming sovereign was no longer solely motivated by obligation or custom. Now, Louis sensed it. This made the load feel closer than it had before. William could understand the anger, since he wasn't only speaking in his role as Prince of Wales. As a father, he was trying to explain a system that had shaped his own life long before he had the power to change it. George silently rejected the explanation. He said he didn't want Louise protected from him while he was alone with his father, acting as though he was a danger to his own brother. William answered immediately. George was not the Dane, the heir. He was dangerous. If Louis was brought up to feel that his only purpose in life was to be with George, his love would eventually turn into obligation, and obligation could turn into rage. The future king heard what was stated, yet it still felt harsh. George struck back more violently. Louis and he could merely promise never to compete, he insisted. They may stay close to one another. They may decide differently. William did not write him off, but he told his son something terrible. The promises given during childhood may be outweighed by the demands of adulthood. Relationships could be impacted by titles, money, attention, obligation, and public comparison, even when two people were deeply in love. George hated hearing that because it made the future appear more powerful than their connection. Then William realized something even more difficult. The plan involved more than just ensuring Louis's safety. It was also meant to protect George. The older brother might eventually feel forced to provide Louis a role, influence, financial support, or purpose because they were family. That duty may become yet another invisible burden on the monarchy. George finally grasped the struggle. His parents believed that since they wanted the boys to remain close as adults, independence had to begin early. But the argument was far from over. William had some influence over the plan's parameters, but he wasn't the most powerful voice. Catherine had already drawn her own lines. She believed that independence would shield Louis, but emotional isolation would harm both sons. Still in agony, George left his father behind. What happened next was up to his mother, and she was going to be very clear about one thing. The monarchy may influence their fates, but it could not destroy their family. Catherine senses something equally powerful to William's recognition of the danger posed by the royal hierarchy. Young people don't think about strategy as such. They see it as acceptance or rejection, closeness or distance. When discussions regarding George and Louis begin to sound too much like separate tracks on a palace chart, she intervenes. Her message is unyielding. Louis will have a future of his own. No one will build a wall between two brothers to protect them, but George will prepare for the throne. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had supported giving Louis an independent future from the beginning. But everything that made being independent feel like being taken away was something she disapproved of. A royal position. Even if official duties and responsibilities carried out on behalf of the monarchy could have an impact on a person's career, she refused to allow them to determine the emotional structure of her family. Having distinct futures was one thing. Families were not the same. William saw the difference and knew she was not going to give up. George needed that assurance more than anyone realized. He had begun to fear that he would lose something every step of the way to becoming king. Higher expectations, less intimacy, less privacy, greater responsibility, less autonomy, and more planning. Catherine could see that worry right away. As she sat with him, she clarified that loving Louis did not mean controlling his brother's life. Importantly, releasing Louis did not mean losing him. George listened intently because his mother was finally addressing the fear that underpinned the anger. Catherine presented a more compelling case. Family traditions would still be shared. Important turning points would still be discussed. George could never be convinced to see his siblings as carrying on his own legacy. Louis would also never discover that continued reliance was necessary for devotion. She wanted George to understand that while he could have power as king, he would never be able to dominate the people he loved. William accepted, even though he knew that implementation of such a concept would need constant care. Then Catherine changed the original scheme. In a private conversation with William, she set aside the planning notes, saying that the children could not simply be told what their future relationship would entail. They must have a voice in it. The prince immediately recognized the significance. Up until then, the adults had been trying to figure out how to help George and Louis. They would now have to contribute to the solution. The family did not, however, have as much time as they had hoped. Louis had already begun to take note of the silence surrounding him. He saw that George was acting differently. He sensed the stress his parents were trying to hide. The youngest brother would soon ask the one question that nobody was ready to answer. The truth had been discovered first by George. Louis was going to understand. The entire emotional balance of the family would change as a result. It doesn't take a royal advisor to let Louis know that things have changed. He recognizes it in George. The older brother starts to act more guarded and cautious, as though daily circumstances suddenly have a deadline. The one person everyone had been trying to protect eventually finds out the truth when Louis demands an explanation. However, his remark surprises the entire family. He is not afraid of an independent future. What frightens George is the idea that independence would mean goodbye. George tries to behave normally, but this just draws attention to the shift. He spends more time with Louis, pays closer attention to him, and considers small things to be suddenly more important than they were. The Princess of Wales, Catherine, immediately understands the danger when she sees it. Giving a child an explanation that is age-appropriate and simplifies a challenging truth so they may understand it without harboring adult worries now feels safer. If no one explains what's happening, Louis might begin to envision something even worse. Finally, Louis asks the question himself. He wants to know why George has been feeling down. George hesitates because speaking the truth is almost as scary as hearing it. He cautions his younger brother that their lives may alter dramatically when they get older. One of them will carry out chores that the other won't. One may spend more time performing royal duties, while the other pursues a life of their own. After paying close attention, Louis asks a question that is so simple that George cannot stop it. But won't we remain brothers? George feels the weight of everything fall in a single sentence. That was the terror that had been causing him to cry all along. He had never been afraid of new jobs, different homes, or varied responsibilities. He feared that Louis would eventually become someone he loved from a distance, and that distance would turn into an emotion. The younger boy has no idea why George thinks that has to happen. Independence does not mean betrayal to Louis. It simply means growing up. William hears enough of the discussion to understand what the adults nearly missed. Various allegiances weren't usually required by various obligations. To prepare to become king, George did not need to treat his brother as though he was about to disappear. Louis was able to create his own personality without parting ways with the person he had grown up with. The prince is aware that the children have reduced a complicated royal matter to something quite clear. But there is still one conversation that needs to be had. This time, parents won't influence the language. Advisors, courtiers, and royal schemes won't hinder them. George and Louis are going to talk in private, and what the younger brother says next will completely change the meaning of those tears. The crucial moment is not provided by a king, an advisor, or a carefully considered palace strategy. It comes from Louis George by himself. By removing any royal complexity, he reduces the problem to something achingly simple. George may eventually ascend to the throne. Louis may choose to lead a completely different life. Whether they stay close is not determined by either fact. George at last stops thinking like an heir and starts listening like an elder brother at that private time. George brings remorse he was never supposed to have as he joins the conversation. He has spent days thinking that the issue was somehow caused by his future role and that he now has an additional duty to safeguard Louise, a successor. There may be constitutional expectations for the heir apparent. However, George has started to view those expectations as a personal obligation to his brother. That's not how Louis sees it. He believes that the issue is much easier than the adults have presented it. At last, George expresses regret. He apologizes to Louis that their lives might not be the same because of what lies ahead for him. Almost instantly, the younger brother pushes back. George did not decide to ascend to the throne. Louis tells him straight out. A youngster is the only one who can. He never made the decision, so why should he apologize for it? George is taken aback by the response since it absolves him of the guilt he has been harboring from the start. Then George acknowledges what really scared him. It was never merely distinct responsibilities. It was the idea of rituals, routines, obligations, and distance gradually taking the place of common brotherhood in adulthood. He was afraid that one day, all of his conversations with Louis would have to go through royal expectations. After listening, the younger boy shares the idea that transforms everything. Maybe he can stay near because he wants to, rather than because the monarchy orders him to, because he has his own path. Louis's notion completely upends the entire plan. Independence is no longer associated with rejection. It sounds like being devoid of bitterness. At last, George realizes what William and Catherine had been attempting to save. His sibling is not being prepared to abandon him. He has enough room to develop into a person who can stand next to him without feeling constrained. George feels at peace for the first time since the initial talk thanks to that knowledge. The future is not resolved by the brothers. They just no longer have the same fear of it. However, family harmony is short-lived. One of George and Louis's public moments will soon be caught and interpreted in a way that is beyond comprehension. Neither brother meant to. The meaning of the tears has altered inside the family. Outside, Britain is about to determine the significance of those tears for the monarchy as a whole. What started out as a private family meeting quickly grew into something much more significant. For years, Britain has witnessed the development of royal siblings under unfair expectations. Additionally, the notion that William and Catherine are consciously attempting to stop another harmful pattern sparks heated public discussion. However, no commentator could adequately convey the source in a single moment. When George and Louis reappear together, they provide a picture that fundamentally alters the public's perception of what has transpired rather than appearing split. William senses the pressure almost instantly. He is aware that people are talking about more than just two kids these days. They are arguing on what kind of monarchy should be established in the future. George has a future that Louis does not because of the hereditary system, which is the custom in which the crown is passed down through a familial line. And all of a sudden, the national dialogue revolves on that distinction. Catherine is aware of the importance of the argument, but she is also aware of how easily personal suffering can become symbolic in public discourse. First and foremost, their sons are brothers, not role models in a royal dispute. The most contentious aspect of the narrative is George's tears. They are seen by some as evidence that royal duty might require sacrifices long before adulthood. Others see William and Catherine's strategy as an effort to stop historical trends from happening again. The prince doesn't like either extreme. He is aware that Louis has never thought independence entails rejection, and that George has already started to find serenity. However, emotions that the boys have already begun to comprehend for themselves are now being given meaning by others. Then the tone shifts in an instant. Following a royal event, George and Louis emerge with the family from St. George's Chapel in Windsor. One of the most significant ceremonial churches in the monarchy, the chapel is intimately associated with royal worship, marriage, and commemoration. Louis speaks softly to his elder brother. George bursts out laughing. Shortly after, the younger boy leans over and takes hold of his arm with an ease that is devoid of fear, distance, or bitterness. The coverage the next morning is dominated by that photograph. Separation is hardly the most compelling headline. It concerns two brothers who seem completely at ease next to each other, in spite of everything that is being spoken around them. William is troubled by the public's apparent realization of the truth when he observes the response. However, his kids are still involved in a bigger discussion. They never make an invitation to join. The topic of discussion changes. Instead of focusing solely on Louis's future, many start questioning if a younger royal can lead a self-sufficient existence without feeling excluded. That question has previously been addressed for George. He started crying because he thought his sibling would be taken away by the crown. He is now starting to realize that his parents were attempting to safeguard the one item that royal duty should never be permitted to possess. George's dread was genuine, and so were his tears. He thought there was a hidden cost to his destiny for one agonizing moment. As he ascended to the throne, he had to see those closest to him gradually fade away. But in the end, Louis's reality showed something else. His future was not being cut off from his younger sibling. It was keeping him from becoming stuck inside of it. And after George understood that difference, the terrible reality turned into the start of a more positive pledge between two royal brothers. Independence is no longer another term meaning loss to George. His training for becoming king will get more intense over time, and Louis will be inspired to find hobbies, employment, companions, and a purpose that are wholly his own. Constitutional duty is decided by succession, the system that establishes who takes the throne. However, William and Catherine won't allow it to determine a person's value within their family. The crown might go to one son. That does not diminish the significance of the other. When the terror subsides, George finds it simpler to understand Louis. He is not being abandoned by the younger sibling. He is being offered the opportunity to develop into someone who can support his position in the family without royal obligation. At last, George realizes that this might be the best defense their relationship can have. Standing by his brother can continue to be an act of love rather than a duty imposed by birth if Louis develops into an adult with his own purpose. Later, George joins Louise without engaging in any more meaningful dialogue. When the younger boy tells a common joke, his older brother laughs right away. The occasion is not marked by any formalities. There is no statement. There is no announcement of a royal decision. However, because the tension has finally subsided, that straightforward conversation has greater significance than all that occurred before it. Once more, Louis is just his brother. Additionally, George no longer views each shared time as a countdown to its conclusion. William is aware of the changes. He used to think that in order to safeguard his sons, he needed to carefully manage how their futures diverged. He now realizes that preserving their love while letting those futures change is the bigger challenge. Catherine comes to the same conclusion. While neither parent can eliminate every burden that lies ahead, They may choose not to instill in their kids the idea that intimacy necessitates living identical lifestyles. Therefore, George's tears do not signify the start of a royal conflict or a fractured family. They symbolize the agonizing realization that love does not entail having someone by your side forever. Love sometimes entails letting that person create a life that is out of your control. The verdict is as unambiguous for the monarchy. Without Louis becoming merely the king's brother, George can ascend to the throne. Louis doesn't have to leave George in order to create his own identity. Though they have separate futures and duties, they are still brothers. Additionally, the monarchy is unable to make a different decision this time. I appreciate your reading. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the future.